Hello and welcome to our very important lecture today. We're going to be discussing the progressive steps that lead to the healing of a fractured bone. So, what are the progressive stepwise process that takes place in order for us to achieve a healthy, healed bone? So, before we get into the progressive steps that unfold and take place in order for the fractured bone to heal in a healthy manner. Let's first define what is a fractured bone. So, a fractured bone is a bone that underwent breakage, defect, and a separation. So there is a defect in the integrity and the continuity of the bone as a one piece. So you no longer have a continuous bone as a one piece. You have this one piece broken probably into two separate pieces, known as complete fracture. And there's also partial fracture, and partial fractures happen when there is a fracture, but it does not completely separate, does not completely separate the bone into two complete pieces. So you see one side is whole while the other side is fractured. So that is a type of a partial fracture. So we have different kinds of fractures. We have what is known as a comminuted fracture. This comminuted fracture is this comminuted fracture is a type of fracture where you would have in the comminuted fracture, you would have a fracture where there are fragments of bone pieces. There would be fragments of bone pieces. Let's repair the lighting. There are fragments of bone pieces scattered all over the place, all over the place. So that is a type of a comminuted fracture. Okay. So we have a comminuted fracture. In addition to the comminuted fracture, we have a type of fracture that is known as the open fracture. What is an open fracture? As soon as I get this done. Okay, okay. All right. Okay, that's a little better. That is a little better. A comminuted fracture. Let us now discuss the concept of a comminuted fracture. Okay, so what is a comminuted? So now we're going to be discussing the concept of a uh, comminuted fracture. So a comminuted fracture would be a type of fracture where there is fragmented bones, and in open fracture you would have the actual splicing. So you would have the breakage of the bone followed by breakage of the muscle and followed by a cut in the skin. So you see the broken bone ruptures all the way out through the skin. So that is a type of a very um, that's a type of a very dangerous um, that's the type of a very dangerous fracture. Well, in the end, whether we're dealing with a partial fracture or we're dealing with a type of part, if we're dealing with a partial fracture, or we're dealing with a complete fracture or an open fracture. If you have different patients coming in with different bone pathologies, in the end, the healing in their different bodies is going to take place in stepwise processes that are pretty uniform. So the first process is known as the organizing hematoma. The organizing hematoma is the first step. What happens is a hematoma is a blood tumor, is a blood clot, is a blood swelling, is a blood collection. So you see this thick cushion like blood collection is going to be surrounding the area, is going to be as seen here, surrounding the area of the fracture. So you see the blood clot, you see the hematoma, and coagulation of blood around the area where there is breakage of the bone. Then the next step is this breakage of the bone leads to rupturing of blood vessels, because we know that bone tissue is a live tissue. It needs oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation, for aerobic respiration. It needs oxygen, and it needs a nutritional supply. It needs carbohydrates for glycolysis, needs lipids for beta oxidation, needs also proteins for protein catabolism. So that is going to be transported to the bone tissue through the blood vessels. So, and we need the blood to remove all the metabolic waste, that this toxic poisonous metabolic waste that builds up in this tissue that utilizes the oxygen and the nutrients. So blood is very important to be delivered to this site of bone tissue. But when the bone breaks, there is a lot of blood vessels invigorating, going through the bone tissue. So themselves they rupture, and a lot of blood spills around the site of the breakage of the bone. So there's a lot of blood. That is known as the organizing hematoma. The next step, so this is very important to get the time in perspective. So from the onset of the breakage and the fracture to about 24 hours after that, what happens now is that we will be having this first stage known as the organizing hematoma. And then you would have, one is the first part of the broken bone, two is the second part. And the gap between them on the first stage was full of blood during the organizing hematoma. On the next stage, you see one, that's the first part of the bone, two is the second part, and between them is a construction site. So you see there's no more redness, no more inflammation. So in the organizing hematoma stage, you see there's a lot of blood, indicating inflammation, indicating there is pain, indicating there is heat, indicating there is swelling, indicating there is loss of function for the tissue and its ability to perform its function at high capacity. There is also very important characteristics of inflammation that lead to the infiltration of immune cells. So immune cells always, this police, have policing and immune surveillance capacity. So they arrive to the site of the inflammation, and this broken this traumatic broken bone tissue is going to be the site of the recruitment of many immune cells, because that is where a lot of debris, there's a lot of broken bone fragments that needs to be removed. Necrotic bone tissue has to be removed by these immune cells known as the macrophages. Also, is a lot of bacterial infection, or maybe opportunistic microbial infection that may take place at the site of the fracture. So that's why there's a lot of immune cells. So after the first stage, the organizing hematoma, we move on to the second stage, and that is known as the soft callus. Callus is a non-calcified tissue. What is callus? Callus is a non-calcified bone tissue. And as you see here, here in the middle, in the organizing hematoma stage, in the middle, there was blood. But here in this stage, there is no blood. There is a construction site. So you see there's a lot of platelets. That makes a lot of sense. Platelets are band-aids. They prevent the loss of blood, and they prevent any potential hypovolemia due to intravascular hemorrhage. So you have a lot of platelets and you have a lot of inflammatory cells continuing to arrive at the site of this construction and this bone genesis and the making of bone tissue. And they obviously, the inflammatory cells, these macrophages, these immune cells, are constantly trying to repair any microbial infection, removing any potential necrotic debris or any malaligned bone tissue. Also, at the site of this construction, you see that the platelets and the inflammatory cells together are secreting platelet-derived growth factor, fibroblast growth factor, and tumor growth factor. Well, GF is growth factor. Whether it's PDGF, platelet-derived growth factor, or FGF, fibroblast growth factor, or TGF beta, transforming growth factor beta, all of them are growth factors. So they stimulate growth. They allow the entry into the mitosis, into the cell division cycle, so that the bone starts to divide to bridge the gap and restore this fracture site with new bone cells. Also at the site of this if on this of this breakage site, you see these platelet derived growth factors and the fibroblast growth factors and the transforming growth factors. They also stimulate the osteoclast and osteoblast. These are very important cells. The osteoclast have a C, so C, they cut. Osteoclasts, they are like jackhammers. They cut and they destroy and remove any malaligned um, bone tissue or necrotic bone tissue, and we utilize them a lot in calcium homeostasis. Osteoblasts have a B, blast, so they build up. These are the cells that build up the bone tissue. So you see, osteoblasts have one big round nucleus, meaning that they will stimulate mitosis, and you see there is a lot of bone tissue buildup. There's also osteoclast. Osteoclast, they have a lot of acid, they have a lot of reactive oxidative species. They have proteolytic enzymes, degradative enzymes, and they have hydrolytic enzymes, metalloproteinases. These enzymes are going to destroy the bone tissue and cause bone resorption. They're going to cause bone resorption. Bone resorption is removal of bone tissue. So we know that in calcium homeostasis, if there is hypercalcemia in the blood, there's too much calcium, then the osteoblasts are going to be stimulated and they're going to take a lot of calcium from the blood and dump it in the bone tissue and build up the bone tissue. Then you have osteoclast. These osteoclasts, they are whenever there is a drop in blood calcium level, hypocalcemia, the osteoclasts are going to destroy the bone tissue and they're going to take a lot of calcium and dump it in the blood to restore eucalcemia. So this stage is known as soft callus because you have progenitor cells. These are dormant cells. Progenitor cells are eventually going to become differentiated chondrocytes. Chondrocytes, sites are the cells. Chondro means cartilage. These are the cartilage making cells. They make cartilage, and cartilage is the first step into making bone. You know, we have milk. When you churn the milk, it becomes thicker and it becomes like butter. So the same thing with cartilage. Cartilage is the milk. Later on, it's going to get thickened and thickened more and more and more until it becomes so thick, and then it becomes bone tissue. So that's the second stage, known as soft callus. No inflammation, it's just a construction site to build up the tissue. Now let's move on to the last, known as the let's move on to the third stage, and that is known as the bony callus. So if the second stage was the soft callus, the third stage is going to be known as the bony callus. So now let us examine the bony callus. Now, what is bony callus? Now, this is the second stage, known as the bony callus stage. Okay, so if we compare here these two stages, what is known as the soft callus, right next to it is the bony callus. If we look a little up, there we go. So this is the soft callus, a construction site where we're going to have soft cartilage tissue. And then we move on to the next stage where we no longer now have soft callus. Now we have bony callus. So you see up here, that was known as the soft. From the onset of the injury to about 2 weeks, that is soft callus. And then after that, we move on to hard or bony callus. So now let's look at the middle. In the middle in soft callus was a construction site. In the middle of the bony callus, you see this red tissue known as the woven bone. This woven bone, now when you compare the two stages, obviously in the bony callus, no more progenitor chondrocytes, no more platelet derived growth factors, no more meshwork of construction site. Now you just have only osteoblast with one big red, with one big nucleus for division, dividing bone tissue, and you also have these osteoclasts with their enzymes to degrade and remove, because no construction with just building. We build and we destroy also. We remodel the bone tissue, and then you see there's hyaline cartilage and endochondral ossification, and that leads to the full restoration in the next subsequent stage after 2 to 3 weeks. That is the stage of bony callus. Lastly, we end up with the last stage, and that is known as the actual. You see now we have completely healthy, healed bone tissue. If you look in the middle here, no more woven tissue. Now you see that there is no difference between 1 and 3. You see the middle is completely perfect, completely properly aligned and properly modeled bone tissue. And that's the last stage, known as the bony callus. So now we have um, completely remodeled bone tissue with the very strong hydroxyapatite. This very important hydroxyapatite um, substance that's going to make the bone tissue very strong.